Good morning. This is the Home American Rescue Plan or HOME-ARP overview. We are re-recording this webinar in order to update some of the guidance that we initially released in the summer of 2022. So this is a re-recording in December of 2022. You have with you today Naomi Cantu, HOME-ARP Director, and there's my contact information, and Tiara Hardaway, and there is her contact information. And Tiara is going to take it from here for the beginning.
Hello, everyone. So this morning's objectives will be to provide an overview of the HOME-ARP program and how TDHCA will distribute the HOME-ARP funds. We will describe each qualifying population and give you some examples on how to document each one of those. And we will also discuss the nonprofit capacity building and operating cost assistance and its eligible activities. All right, so to start off, the HOME-ARP program was established by the American Rescue Plan. The Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs was allocated approximately $132 million in HOME-ARP funds and a one-time allocation from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HOME-ARP is based on HUD's Home Investment Partnerships Program, the Home Annual Funding Program, infrastructure, and has significant differences compared. HOME-ARP has significant differences compared to the Home Annual Program. Those differences include waivers of certain federal regulations and the addition of new activities. And lastly, the federal expenditure deadline for the program is September 30th, 2030. However, we are planning to expend well before that date. A brief overview of the HOME-ARP program. Households must meet a definition of a qualified population, QP, to be eligible and may not need to income qualify. Qualified populations pay no more than 30% of their income towards rent. And because rent is so low, there may be other financing structures in place to assist developments to be financially viable. And also, HOME-ARP offers many new eligible activities that we plan to fund, those including the nonprofit capacity building and non-congregate shelter. So let's talk about the new activities. One new activity is to acquire and develop non-congregate shelter. NCS units are private units or rooms as temporary shelters to individuals. The units must include sanitary facilities in each unit and serve a qualifying population. Also, NCS does not require occupants to sign a lease or occupancy agreement. We will not cover NCS in this webinar, but more information will be released at a later date. And the second new activity is capacity building, which is geared toward assisting nonprofits to expand or improve their organization to carry out HOME-ARP activities. And we will be discussing more in depth this later in the presentation. So the TDHCA HOME-ARP Allocation Plan was approved in May of 2022. And as you can see from the chart, we plan to expend majority of the $132 million allocated to this program on rental housing and non-congregate shelter development. 5% is allocated to the nonprofit capacity building assistance and operating assistance, and 10% for administration. Next, we'll talk about timeline of expending these funds. Currently, we have released an application for a set-aside for active National Housing Trust Fund applications that were awarded funds in either 2020 or 2021 and have increased costs and may be in jeopardy of not being completed. Those funds were maxed at $10 million. Unexpended funds have been rolled over to our rental housing NOFA that was released at the December board meeting. The rental housing NOFA will also include nonprofit capacity building and operating cost assistance. We plan to release a NOFA for the capacity building assistance for development of a large-scale shelter in 2023. And finally, the release of the non-congregate shelter NOFA, the capacity building NOFA will be 12 to 18 months after capacity building funds are released tentatively in summer of 2023. Next, we will have Naomi to talk about how HOME-ARP is different and the specific populations it is working to serve.
Thank you, Tara. So we're going to talk about home qualifying populations. We are a different program than home annuals, mainly because of our HOME-ARP qualifying populations. The qualifying populations are persons experiencing homelessness or formerly homeless, persons at risk of homelessness, those at greatest risk of instability, and persons fleeing domestic violence. These definitions are similar to other homeless programs, but have been modified in certain ways. Also, veterans can qualify if they meet the criteria of one of the other qualifying populations, but is not a qualified population in and of itself. We will go over the most commonly used qualified population, or QP, definition during this presentation. Our goal is to provide some idea of what to expect in many cases of eligibility. However, you will not be able to leave this webinar being able to qualify households as a QP. We will have further guidance on determining eligibility for persons in each of these categories at a later date, and anticipate that it will be its own webinar. There are many definitions, and from my experience, it can be sometimes daunting when faced with so much criteria. Stay tuned through other webinars for possible streamlining of the eligibility process. So there will be more guidance upcoming. When talking about eligibility criteria, let's be thinking about documentation as well. There are 3 tiers of documentation for these categories. First, third-party documentation should be requested. Second, intake worker observations, and this is usually intake worker from homeless programs, if there's any referrals. And third, certification from the person seeking assistance. An exception is permitted when a written observation by the intake worker or third-party documentation would jeopardize the safety of the individual or family in a domestic violence situation. The first qualified population, or QP, is for persons who are experiencing homelessness, literally homeless, imminent risk, and homeless under other statutes. HUD offers a definition and record-keeping handout, as listed on the page. Note that this handout is tailored to homeless service providers and has a 4th category that is not applicable to HOME-ARP, which is domestic violence. So if you download these materials, please note the difference. Domestic violence is eligible, but not under homeless. A person needs to meet one of these 3 definitions to be defined under homelessness. Homeless category 1 is literally homeless. The most common examples could be living in a car park or persons living in a shelter. There are less common examples of literally homeless that we will go through in a separate webinar specifically on QP eligibility. Homeless category 2 is someone who will lose their primary residence in 14 days with no other place to stay and no other resource. The 3rd category has many criteria, and it's for youth or family with children that need to qualify under another definition of homelessness from another federal statute and have housing instability from a list of factors. Here are examples of documentation for homelessness. Literally homeless can include written observation by an outreach worker of the conditions where the individual or household was living, a written referral by another housing or service provider, or a certification by the individual or head of household seeking assistance. Imminent risk of homelessness. A court order resulting from an eviction action or equivalent legal notice that requires the individual or family to leave their residence within 14 days after the date of their application. Homeless under other statutes, the 3rd one, has many different criteria to meet, An example to meet the first criteria could be a certification from a local nonprofit or state agency administering assistance under the statute. Examples for housing instability could be a written diagnosis from a professional who is licensed by the state to diagnose and treat a condition, employment records, Department of Correction records, literacy or English proficiency tests. Here's an example of homeless category 2. Mary and her daughter Margaret have been staying with Mary's brother Rob in the condo he owns. Rob says Mary and Margaret can no longer stay with him as of next week. Mary and Margaret may qualify as imminent risk of homelessness if Rob provides a notice to vacate to Mary, and if Mary certifies there is no other residence or resources or support networks they have to obtain permanent housing. For HOME-ARP, a unique population not in many other homeless assistance programs is a household that was formerly homeless. So that means the household was documented to have met one of the definitions on the previous slides. That household received assistance, so they would not be homeless, but the assistance they are receiving is going to run out. If it runs out, the household is expected to return to homelessness. This qualifies under formerly homeless and currently housed. The same third-party documentation as homeless definition would be needed, along with documentation of current assistance, end date by agency providing assistance, and demonstration of additional need. Note that documentation may be subject to change based on future HUD guidance. HOME-ARP also has at-risk of homelessness categories for QP. These are in 3 categories as well. 1, individuals and families. 2, unaccompanied youth and children. And 3, families with children and youth. Again, there are HUD resources available to show eligibility and documentation as listed on the slide. Definition 1 is the most common definition used for at-risk of homelessness. The household has to have income below 30% area median income, or AMI. They cannot have sufficient resources or support networks to prevent them from becoming homeless. And they need to meet one of several conditions that indicate risk of homelessness. There are many criteria listed on the statute, and some of the most commonly used are listed on the slide, such as moved 2 or more times in the past 60 days because of economic reasons, losing the right to occupy current housing within 21 days of applying, living in a hotel or motel that is not paid by government support or charity, or exiting a public institution or system of care. Here's an example of at risk of homelessness. Mark has been staying at a hotel for 5 nights. He has run out of funds. His income is below 30% AMI, and he certifies he lacks resources and supports. So documentation includes writing a statement that the intake staff visited the hotel and talked to the manager, or writing a statement that Mark provided hotel receipts for the last 5 days. Examples include income qualification and certifications of lack of resources and supports, and eviction notice that demonstrate one of the criteria, or notices of termination from employment that demonstrate one of the criteria, or bank statements that demonstrate one of the criteria, or written statement by the relevant third party. So this is at risk of homelessness, individuals and families. So this is the second or third criteria. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the first criteria. And so it has many examples of documentation that we could use to document, depending on what criteria they meet. Both at risk of homelessness category 2 and 3 have to do with household qualifying as homeless under other statutes, such as Runaway and Homeless Youth Act or Head Start Act, or in the case of Category 3, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which is mainly used in schools. The documentation for children and youth and their families is certification by the agency that administers the other programs under which the household qualifies. Most definitions used by many other homeless service providers are households at greatest risk of housing instability. These are unique for HOME-ARP. There are two of these household types. The first one is for persons who would otherwise qualify for at risk of homelessness, but their income is 50% AMI instead of 30% AMI, and they just meet one of the criteria for at risk of homelessness. So we have discussed before about the at risk of homeless criteria, and it also applies to at greatest risk of housing instabilities, except for the AMI is higher, and there is not a requirement to demonstrate lack of resources and support network. The second part of the households that are at greatest risk of housing instability are those with income less than or equal to 30% of the area median income and experience severe cost burden, i.e. paying more than 50% of the monthly housing income towards housing costs. The documentation for at risk of housing instability. At risk of homelessness with higher AMI. So if they would meet one of the at-risk homeless criteria, except with 50% AMI and without the need to document lack of resources and supports. And the second one is income evaluation form and source documents for assets and copy of lease or rental agreement showing cost burden. The last QP for HOME-ARP are persons fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. Examples include a written certification by victim service provider, intake worker, social worker, legal assistance provider, healthcare provider, law enforcement agency, or the rest of the list on the slide, or a written certification by individual or head of household. So I have covered all 4 QP eligible households: homeless, at risk of homelessness, or at greatest risk of housing instability, and persons fleeing domestic violence or trafficking. Next year, we'll talk about referrals and documentation.
Thank you, Naomi. So when using the referral methods, projects are required to have an appropriate documentation on site. Referral methods that include homeless service providers may allow a more streamlined review for the property if the referring agency will share QP eligibility documentation. So eligibility documentation of QP status and verification of status must be kept at the project, but the documentation and verification from the referral agency may be transferred. The project is ultimately responsible for the accuracy of the QP eligibility criteria. So there may be risk involved in accepting a referral without verification from the project. And in addition to obtaining eligibility documentation from the referral property, you must document other preferences or limitations reflected in the contract and student status, and to determine if there are other items, including but not limited to household income and the calculation of the tenant's portion of their rent. And as we discussed previously, we are releasing another webinar that's specifically going to assist agencies with their wait lists and coordinated entry and referral methods. So please look forward to that, and those items will be released pretty soon. All right, next we are going to talk about nonprofit capacity building and nonprofit operating assistance. HOME-ARP funds are being made available to provide capacity building and operating cost assistance to nonprofit organizations. The capacity building assistance can be used to expand or improve the organization so that it will be able to carry out HOME-ARP activities. There has to be a reasonable expectation that the nonprofit will apply for and be awarded another HOME-ARP activity within 24 months. The operating cost assistance is meant to support the existing general operating costs of the organization and cannot be associated with a final cost objective, such as a particular award, internal project, or other direct activity. As you can see, the Capacity Building and Nonprofit Operating Assistance Fund may have similar activities from the chart presented. The payroll for capacity building is for new hires, and the payroll for operating cost assistance is for existing hires, but not project level expenses, such as resident service coordinator or a property level monitoring. The second eligible cost is training to expand skills, though the operating, it cannot be tied to a particular property. Equipment and upgrades to supplies are allowable for capacity, while with operating assistance, it's for general equipment, materials, and supplies. Capacity building can fund technical assistants and consultants with expertise related to new activities and the qualifying populations, and operating assistance cannot pay for TA or consultants, but it can pay for rent and utilities, communication costs, and types of taxes and insurance. So we get the most questions about the operating costs and what's eligible and what's ineligible. So any costs directly assignable to a HOME-ARP activity or project are ineligible for operating cost assistance. If the operating costs can be charged to HOME-ARP activity, it must be charged to that HOME-ARP activity. So for example, any cost to develop rental housing would be a hard or soft cost. It could not be charged to the operating assistance fund. A trickier example is supportive services to the residents. This is an eligible HOME-ARP cost under the federal program through TDHCA, but we have not programmed funding into this activity. However, because it is an eligible federally activity, a developer cannot charge supportive services to operating assistants. And HOME-ARP has a program prohibits funds being used to cover shelter operating funds, so another ineligible activity. While nonprofit operating expenses are eligible, operation expenses for emergency shelters are prohibited. Costs related to operating an emergency shelter, for example, services, overhead, and staffing costs, property insurance, and utilities are all ineligible. There also are some additional requirements. Equipment, materials, and supplies must be tracked and reported if the aggregate is over $5,000. For operating costs, rental space must have been procured in order to be eligible. Taxes are limited to employment for the organization, and insurance is specific to board of directors and officers, and the property insurance would only be for the general office space. So NCO will be made available through competitive NOFAs. The nonprofit capacity and operating assistance will be competitive. The NOFAs will either be combined with the rental housing construction or the non-congregate shelter or separately. For example, we plan to release the NCO to build the capacity to develop a large-scale shelter. We plan to release a NOFA for that. So the minimum award amount is $50,000 to be expended during the contract term specified in the NOFA. In the maximum in any fiscal year, these activities may not exceed the greater of 50% of the general operating expenses or $75,000, whichever amount is indicated in the released NOFA. All right, and that was wrapping up our capacity and non-operating assistance. So just to recap today what we discussed, we started off with the background of HOME-ARP and its differences from the HOME Annual Program and what is included in TDHCA's approved allocation plan, the breakdown of the eligible activities, and when those funds will be released. We also discussed the 5 qualifying populations as homeless and formerly homeless, at risk of homelessness, at greatest risk of housing instability, and those that are fleeing domestic violence, and provided some examples of how to document each of those. And lastly, we went through the nonprofit and capacity building operating assistance and its eligible activities and limitations. So thank you so much for joining the webinar today. And please visit the HOME-ARP website listed on the slide for additional information. We also have a HOME-ARP rental guidance webinar that is posted where we take a deep dive into the financial implications of the HOME-ARP program. And if there's any questions about HOME-ARP activity, please reach out to any of our HOME-ARP staff members. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this re-recording, and please note that during the presentation there were indications of when slides were adjusted. Thank you so much.